Before we get into this story, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe if you enjoy these bedtime gangster stories. Your support helps us bring more untold sagas to life. People knew the name Gotti long before they ever knew Peter. In the late 1980s and early 90s, John Gotti, the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, ruled the headlines. His sharp suits, wide grin, and open defiance of the law made him larger than life, a celebrity mob boss who drew cameras the way fire draws moths. But behind that glare of attention was another Gotti brother, one who never smiled for the cameras, who walked the same sidewalks but never chased the spotlight. That was Peter. To most people, he was invisible. If you passed him in Queens in those days, you'd never guess he was part of one of the most powerful crime families in America. He dressed plain, spoke softly, and kept his eyes low. Where John basked in attention, Peter moved like a shadow. And in the world of organized crime, shadows often outlast the men who burn too brightly. Peter was born in 1939, the oldest son in a rough Italian-American family. Queens in those days was working class, built on grit and survival. Loyalty was currency, silence was armor, and respect was non-negotiable. From a young age, Peter absorbed those lessons. He didn't chase fights, but he didn't walk away from them either. He learned that a man's word carried farther than his fists, but both had to be ready when the time came. His younger brother John rose fast. Charisma carried him, along with a taste for power and risk. The newspapers couldn't get enough of him, the Dapper Don made for perfect copy. But that attention cut both ways. It brought fame, yes, but it also brought the eyes of the FBI, wiretaps, and prosecutors eager to make a name by bringing him down. Peter watched it all with quiet patience. He wasn't jealous of John's shine, he simply understood what it cost. The louder you played the game, the shorter you lasted in it. So Peter stayed behind the curtain, managing small operations, handling men, keeping things steady while his brother danced with danger. Inside the family, that steadiness earned him respect. He wasn't flashy, but he was dependable. And in the mafia, dependability could be as deadly as bravado. By the early 1990s, the cracks had begun to show. Federal indictments stacked against John, and eventually, the so-called Teflon Don was sentenced to life in prison. The spotlight that had once followed him everywhere dimmed. But power doesn't vanish, it shifts. And when John's fall left a void at the top of the Gambino family, the question arose, who would carry the weight now? Many expected a bloody struggle, a clash of hungry captains fighting for the crown. But instead, the quiet brother stepped forward. Peter, always in the background, always steady, was suddenly at the front. Not because he wanted glory, but because the family needed someone who wouldn't crumble under the pressure. His leadership was not loud, but it was firm. And so began the reign of the Silent Don, a man who inherited a storm and tried to hold it steady while the world around him changed faster than anyone expected. The streets were restless in the years after John's fall. For decades, the Gambino name had been tied to spectacle, big headlines, big trials, big money. But now, with John locked away, the family needed something different. They needed calm, order, and someone who could steady the wheel without drawing more fire from the FBI. That responsibility landed on Peter's shoulders. He never chased it. He never asked for it. But in the mafia, leadership doesn't always come to the man who wants it most. Sometimes it comes to the one the others trust not to sink the ship. Peter became that man. Where his brother had been bold and reckless, Peter was cautious, deliberate. He knew the walls were closing in, and one wrong step could bring the whole house down. The contrast between the brothers couldn't have been sharper. John had paraded through Little Italy in $1,000 suits, smiling for the cameras, blowing kisses to reporters. He fed on attention, almost daring law enforcement to try again and fail. Peter wore simple jackets, ate in diners, walked home the same way every night. If John was the showman, Peter was the stagehand, pulling strings in silence. And in truth, that difference saved the family from crumbling completely after John was gone. Still, not everyone liked Peter's style. Younger men in the family grumbled. They wanted quick money, fast expansion, the kind of high-profit ventures that had already pulled other crews into drugs and international schemes. Peter had seen where that led: long sentences, betrayals, lives ended too soon. He preferred the traditional rackets: gambling, loans, construction payoffs. They weren't glamorous, but they kept the machine moving without shining a light on the gears. At night, in smoky back rooms and cramped apartments, the arguments grew sharper. Some captains pressed him to take bigger risks. They spoke of rivals in Brooklyn and Jersey, men who were already filling the gaps left by John's fall. "If we don't move, they will," one captain warned, his voice low but urgent. Peter listened, leaning back in his chair, eyes steady. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist. Instead, he said, "You want to play like John, you'll end up where John is. Dead or behind bars for life. I'm not burying more brothers." The words hung heavy in the room. No one dared push further that night. But the grumbling didn't stop. The younger blood wanted a bigger piece of the pie, and Peter's caution felt like chains to them. They respected him, yes, but respect built on fear and necessity is fragile. Outside those meetings, the FBI was tightening its net. Wiretaps were picking up whispers. Surveillance vans parked longer near social clubs. Friends who once swore loyalty were starting to crack under pressure, their names quietly slipping onto government witness lists. Peter sensed it, even if he didn't know the details. He had lived long enough to know when the ground under his feet was shifting. One evening, walking home from a diner in Queens, a young soldier approached him with wide eyes and too much excitement. "Boss, I got a plan. It'll double our money in 6 months if we move fast." Peter stopped, looked the kid over, then motioned to sit. "Plans made in doorways," he said calmly, "end in graves. If you want to talk, you sit down like a man." The boy sat. And Peter, as always, chose silence and patience over noise and risk. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks spread wider. The meeting that followed weeks later showed just how wide those cracks had become. It wasn't in a club or a restaurant where anyone might be listening. It was above a bakery in Brooklyn, a small apartment with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of bread clinging to the air. Men filed in quietly, their coats heavy with winter, their eyes carrying the weight of uncertainty. Peter arrived last, not to make a show, but because he always checked the street before stepping inside. When he finally sat down at the narrow table, the voices around him were already buzzing. Some spoke of shrinking profits, others of rivals who were creeping in, carving up territory that had once been theirs. A younger captain leaned forward, frustration written across his face. "We're dying slow, Pete. If we don't expand, if we don't take what's there, we'll have nothing left." The room quieted, every eye turning to the silent Don. He lit a cigarette, his hands steady, his expression calm. For a moment he said nothing, letting the smoke curl up toward the ceiling. Then he answered, his voice low but firm. "Careful is the reason you're all sitting here and not behind glass talking to your kids through a phone. You think fast money saves you? It buries you faster." Some nodded out of habit, but others shifted uneasily. The younger men, the ones who had grown up watching John on TV, didn't want patience. They wanted glory. One of them spoke again, his voice sharper now. "With respect, boss, the feds are coming either way. We should at least make it worth it." Peter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's the talk of a man who's never buried a brother. You want to play big, you pay big. And the cost isn't always yours, it's your family's too." His words carried the weight of someone who had lived it, who had watched the price of ambition destroy more than one Gotti. The discussion dragged late into the night, circling the same arguments. Old ways versus new. Patience versus hunger. When the meeting finally broke, nothing had been settled. Some men left loyal, others left restless, but Peter knew the truth. Control was slipping, not in one dramatic moment, but in small fractures that spread quietly until a wall gave way. He walked home through the wet streets of Brooklyn, neon lights flickering in puddles, the city alive around him but strangely distant. He thought of John, once untouchable, now locked away for life. He thought of his children, growing older under the shadow of a name that no longer brought pride but suspicion. And he thought of the men who sat across from him tonight, some loyal, some not, all carrying their own doubts. At his door, Peter paused. Inside, his family slept, unaware of the storm he carried on his back. He turned the key slowly, stepped inside, and closed the door with care. For one more night, at least, the world outside could wait. Morning broke the same way it always did, trucks rattling down cracked streets, horns echoing off brick buildings, the city refusing to pause. Peter sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The newspaper lay folded beside him, its headlines screaming about politics and crime, but he didn't need ink to tell him the truth. He felt it in the air. Something was closing in. His wife moved quietly behind him, the clatter of dishes filling the silence. She never asked questions. She had learned long ago that answers in this life carried more weight than anyone could bear. The kids came and went in a rush of coats and backpacks, trying to live ordinary lives under a name that could never be ordinary. Peter watched them leave with the same heavy calm every morning. Out there, he was the boss. In here, he was just a father who wished his children didn't have to pay the price for choices they never made. By afternoon, he was back in familiar territory, a corner club where the walls smelled of smoke and spilled liquor. A soldier slipped inside, nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He had been picked up the night before, questioned, then released. "They asked about you," the soldier muttered, eyes darting around the room. "Names. Meetings. They know more than they should." Peter studied him for a long moment before speaking. "And what did you say?" "Nothing. I swear. I kept my mouth shut." Peter nodded once. "Good. Now keep it that way." But even as he said it, he knew pressure had a way of cracking stone, and fear could turn loyalty into betrayal overnight. That evening, a lawyer he trusted delivered worse news. Indictments were being drawn. Wiretaps had been running for months, maybe years. Evidence was stacking, and names were already circled on prosecutors' lists. The government wasn't circling anymore, they were moving in. Peter walked out into the night with the lawyer's words echoing in his head. Queens buzzed as it always had, neon signs glowing above pizza shops, buses hissing at corners, teenagers shouting across streets. But to Peter, the city looked different now. Every car that slowed might be watching him. Every familiar face might be carrying a wire. The same sidewalks he had walked all his life now felt like the floor of a cage. Back home, he sat again at the kitchen table where his mornings always began. This time, he didn't touch the paper or sip the coffee. He just sat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. He knew the storm was no longer on the horizon, it was right outside his door. The only question left was how long he could hold steady before it finally broke through. The storm hit without warning, the way it always does when the government decides its case is ready. It began at the edges, low-level soldiers pulled from their homes before dawn, wives crying on doorsteps, children staring wide-eyed as unmarked cars swallowed their fathers. Some men were released within hours, sent back with nothing but the fear planted in their ears. Others vanished into holding cells, left to stew in silence until the pressure made them talk. Peter knew the pattern. He'd seen it in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. First the pawns, then the rooks, and eventually the king. He moved carefully, keeping business slow, instructing the captains not to take chances. No phones. No long meetings. No loose talk, he told them. But he also knew caution only slowed the inevitable. The feds had time, money, and a patience that outlasted any crew. One winter evening, as snowflakes drifted across Queens, he gathered his closest circle in a basement room. The air was damp, the light a dull yellow bulb swinging slightly overhead. The men were restless, their voices sharp, fear making them loud. One argued to shut everything down until the heat passed. Another slammed his fist on the table, insisting they should push harder to make up for losses. Peter let them argue, eyes moving from one face to the next, measuring each man. When the noise finally broke, he spoke in his usual calm. Men who panic dig their own graves. Men who rush do the same. We stay steady. If they come for me, you keep this family standing. That's all that matters. The words quieted the room, but he could feel the cracks. Some nodded out of loyalty, others out of fear, and a few because they didn't know what else to do. Peter knew the difference. He knew not all of them would hold if the pressure grew heavier. And then it did. Leaving a diner one night, he pulled his coat tighter against the cold, a cigarette between his fingers. Two dark sedans rolled up fast, doors swinging open, agents moving in from every side. There were no raised voices, no drawn guns, just firm hands, cold cuffs, and charges rattled off into the night air. Racketeering. Conspiracy. Extortion. The words blurred together, but none of them surprised him. At the precinct, the questioning began. Agents leaned close, offering deals, telling him the world had changed, that silence was a fool's loyalty. He listened without reaction, his hands folded on the table, eyes steady. When he finally spoke, it was only to ask for water. He gave them nothing. In the cell that night, lying on a thin mattress, he stared at the ceiling, the hum of pipes echoing above him. He thought of his children, how they would hear the news, how their lives would shift again because of the name they carried. He thought of John, already locked away, and wondered if this was how the story always had to end for men like them. The dawn came gray and cold. The bars cast long shadows across the floor, and Peter sat up slowly. He wasn't free anymore, but in the only way that mattered to him, he was still unbroken. Silent. Steady. Carrying the weight alone. The trial was everything Peter expected it to be, loud, crowded, and built for spectacle. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, microphones waving like flags, waiting for him to speak. He never did. Each morning he was led inside in a pressed suit, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed ahead. If they wanted a headline, they weren't getting it from him. Silence was still his best defense. Inside, the air was heavy with whispers and the shuffle of papers. Prosecutors painted him as the hidden hand that kept the Gambino family alive after John's fall. They played wiretaps, showed photographs, laid out diagrams connecting meetings to money, to men, to crimes. Witness after witness took the stand, many of them faces Peter had once trusted at his own table. Now they pointed fingers, their voices shaky but their words enough to build a case. His lawyers fought hard. They picked apart testimony, questioned motives, reminded the jury that Peter had never been the flamboyant figure his brother was. They argued that the government was desperate to put a name in the headlines, and Peter was the easiest one left. But the truth was plain, the feds had too much. Years of surveillance, deals caught on tape, and men willing to trade loyalty for lighter sentences. Piece by piece, the wall closed in. Through it all, Peter stayed steady. No outbursts. No visible anger. Not when old friends betrayed him, not when prosecutors called him ruthless, not even when jurors glanced his way with narrowed eyes. He had seen enough trials to know that rage only fed the government story. He gave them nothing. The verdict came down in a hushed courtroom. Guilty, racketeering, conspiracy, extortion. The judge's voice was even, but the words landed like stone, 9 years in federal prison. Some gasped, some scribbled notes, but Peter didn't flinch. He nodded once, as if he'd already accepted it before walking into the room. Back in his cell that night, the world felt smaller. The mattress was thin, the air sharp with disinfectant. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, his hands clasped loosely. He thought about his children, how they'd live with the shadow of his name once again splashed across newspapers. He thought of the men scrambling on the outside, some clinging to the old ways, others chasing the new. And he thought of John, still locked away, a reminder of what chasing glory had cost them all. Sleep came slowly, broken by the sound of clanging doors and voices echoing through the corridor. But even in the silence of that cell, Peter reminded himself of the one rule he had never broken: never give them your voice. The law could take years, it could take freedom, it could strip away everything but his name. His silence, that was his own, and he intended to keep it. Prison had its own rhythm, and Peter learned it quickly. The clang of doors at dawn, the shuffle of boots on concrete, the hollow echo of trays sliding across metal tables. For some men, it was chaos. For Peter, it was just another system to understand. He kept to himself, spoke little, and before long even the hardest men knew he wasn't someone to test. In the yard, he walked slow, hands behind his back, eyes moving without seeming to. Younger inmates sometimes stared, eager to prove themselves, but the space around him stayed clear. Respect wasn't always loud, it was the silence that followed when a man passed, the unspoken rule that you didn't bother him unless you had a reason. Peter carried that kind of weight. Still, the nights were long. Lying on the thin mattress, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, he replayed his life in fragments. His brother's laugh echoing through a club, his mother's kitchen crowded with voices, his children's small hands reaching for him before he left the house. Regret slipped in quietly, like a draft through a window. Not regret for the life he chose, he had accepted that long ago, but regret for what it had cost the people who had never chosen it. Letters arrived, sometimes from family, sometimes from men still loyal on the outside. They wrote of business, of the streets, of younger captains growing restless. Peter replied rarely, but when he did, a single sentence carried more weight than pages from anyone else. "Patience saves more men than pride," he once wrote. The message was passed from hand to hand, whispered like scripture among those still loyal. But the government never stopped pressing. More indictments circled. Guards whispered about prosecutors wanting to pile on new charges, hoping to break the silent Don's code. Each time, the offer came the same way: cooperate and walk free sooner. Each time, Peter refused without hesitation. His silence wasn't stubbornness, it was the last piece of himself he wouldn't let them take. One afternoon in the cafeteria, a young inmate leaned close and whispered, "You could be out by now if you just gave them something." Peter looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to his tray. He didn't need to answer. The silence was enough. Seasons shifted outside. Snow gave way to rain, rain gave way to summer heat, but the walls stayed the same. Visits from his children were bittersweet, smiles stretched thin across glass, conversations too short, hands pressed to the divider as if that alone could close the distance. He forced himself to smile for them, to act as though the years didn't weigh on him. But when the visit ended and the door closed, the silence returned heavier than ever. Through it all, Peter never bent. Prison stripped him of freedom, but it couldn't strip him of who he was. He carried himself with the same steady presence he always had, quiet, unbroken, a man who had chosen to survive not through noise, but through silence. The years inside finally passed, and one gray morning Peter walked out through the gates, the air colder and sharper than he remembered. Freedom didn't feel like triumph. It felt strange, almost borrowed, as if the world had moved on without him and left him standing in place. He was older now, his body slower, his steps heavier, but his silence was the same. Family was waiting. Hugs lasted longer than words, tear-stained jackets, and for a moment he let himself breathe in their warmth. But the years he had lost pressed in quickly. His children were grown, their faces carrying lines of lives lived while he was counting days on a prison clock. They had carried his name, his shadow, through schools and jobs, through questions they never asked for. He smiled at them, but inside he felt the guilt settle deeper. Time was something no man could win back. The city was different, too. Queens still buzzed, but the faces on the corners weren't the same. Old storefronts had vanished, new ones stood in their place. Crews he had once known were scattered or gone, and younger men spoke of business he barely recognized: cyber scams, overseas deals, money moved with keystrokes instead of handshakes. The Gambino family name still carried weight, but it no longer ruled the streets the way it once had. Still, men came to see him. Out of respect, out of curiosity, maybe even out of habit. They sat across from him in quiet diners, leaning close, asking for guidance. Peter listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his advice was simple, stripped down to what mattered most. Quick money burns quick. If you want to last, think long. Some nodded, grateful for his words. Others smiled politely but had no patience for his caution. Peter knew the difference. Nights were quiet. He sat by a window in his modest home, the city lights blinking in the distance, the sound of sirens fading into the hum of traffic. Sometimes his thoughts drifted to John, the brother who had chased the spotlight and ended up buried by it. People still told stories about John in bars and street corners, making him into a legend. Peter's story was different, less glamour, less glory, more weight. He wasn't a legend. He was a reminder. One evening, a young relative asked him bluntly, "Uncle, was it worth it?" The room went still, every eye waiting. Peter took a long breath, his gaze fixed on the floor, and answered with words as plain as his life. "You only know the cost when it's too late." He said nothing else. And no one asked again. Outside, the world spun faster every year, moving toward things Peter no longer tried to understand. But he didn't need to. His place was no longer to lead, no longer to chase, but simply to watch and remember. The silent dawn had survived the storm, but what he returned to was no longer his kingdom, it was a city that barely remembered his rule. Age crept in quietly, heavier than any prison sentence. His knees stiffened, his breath grew short on stairways, and doctor visits became routine. The strength that had once carried him through street wars and courtroom battles was fading, but Peter never let it show more than he had to. He still carried himself with the same calm dignity, slow steps, steady eyes, silence that spoke louder than words. At family gatherings, he was no longer the one giving orders, no longer the man with power in his pocket. Instead, he was a symbol. Men kissed his cheek out of respect, pulled out chairs for him, leaned in when he chose to speak. His words were short, but they carried the weight of decades. Keep your head down. Don't trust a man who talks too much. Family first. Simple advice, but no one doubted the truth behind it. Outside, the world of organized crime had changed. The Gambino family name still lingered, but it didn't dominate the streets like before. Rivals had carved their share, new crews had risen, and law enforcement was sharper, quicker, and always watching. The young men chasing money now worked differently, through computers, overseas connections, deals too fast and too far for the old ways to keep up. The golden age of the mob was gone, and Peter knew it. Still, younger members came to him now and then. They wanted his blessing, his wisdom, or maybe just a connection to the past. He gave them what little he could, never strategy, never secrets, only warnings. Loyalty saves you, and it breaks you. Don't forget that. Some listened, some didn't. But Peter didn't chase them. He knew men had to learn lessons the hard way, just as his brother had. At night, when the house was quiet, he thought back on everything he had carried. His mother's voice in a warm kitchen, John's laughter echoing in a crowded club, the cold air of prison yards, the soft sound of his children's voices over short visits. The memories didn't leave, they stacked, one on top of the other, until the silence around him felt as heavy as the life he had lived. One afternoon, as he shuffled down a block he had known since childhood, an old neighbor spotted him and said with a smile, "Pete, you're still standing." Peter gave a small nod, the corner of his mouth lifting for just a second. That was all. He didn't need to answer with more. Survival was answer enough. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, throwing long shadows across the streets of Queens, Peter felt it deep inside. He had outlasted many louder men, rivals, allies, even his own brother. Not because he shouted louder, not because he was untouchable, but because he chose silence where others chose noise. In the end, silence had kept him alive. The final years settled over Peter like a long winter. The city outside his window kept moving, sirens in the distance, buses grinding down worn streets, kids laughing on corners, but for him, the world had narrowed. Most days were spent in a chair by the window, the same view of Queens he had known his whole life, only quieter now. He didn't chase calls, didn't attend meetings, didn't try to keep up with the younger men who claimed to carry the Gambino name forward. His time of leading was long past. His health declined in steady steps. Doctor visits grew frequent, the hours in hospitals blending together, blood tests, quiet voices of nurses, machines that hummed and blinked. He bore it all without complaint. When family asked how he was feeling, his answer was always the same: "I'm all right." Nothing more. To speak of pain would have meant giving it power, and Peter had never given anything power over him if he could help it. Family remained his anchor. Children who were once small enough to sit on his lap now stood taller, with lives and families of their own. They visited often, filling the rooms with laughter, arguments, stories about jobs, children, and futures that had nothing to do with the shadow of the Gambino name. Peter listened more than he spoke, smiling faintly, his pride quiet but real. He had missed too much, but in their presence he found a piece of peace he had never known in the streets. Occasionally, younger men still came to him, hungry for advice or simply eager to sit in the presence of a name they grew up hearing. He no longer gave them guidance for business. Instead, he gave them warnings in words stripped of glamour. The streets don't love you back. Remember that. Some nodded with respect, others smirked, certain they would outsmart the fate that claimed generations before them. Peter didn't argue. Time would teach them what he already knew. On quiet nights, when the house was still, he let his mind wander through the years. His brother John, always larger than life, now remembered as both legend and cautionary tale. Friends buried, enemies forgotten, children raised in his absence, years spent behind bars where silence was the only shield. The victories seemed small compared to the losses, yet he never let bitterness grow. He had chosen his path, and he had carried it in silence to the very end. When the end finally came, it was as quiet as his life had been. No headlines, no cameras, no spectacle. Just family at his side, a man breathing his last in peace after decades spent carrying storms on his shoulders. His story lived on only in whispers, among old men who remembered him, among younger ones who spoke of him with a mix of awe and warning. Peter Gotti left the world as he had lived in it, steady, silent, and unbroken. A man who proved that survival in the underworld was not about glory or noise, but about the strength to endure without ever breaking the code he lived by. The Silent Don's era ended not with thunder, but with a whisper. Before we close this saga, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you want more stories like this, bedtime tales of power, loyalty, and survival told from the shadows.